Hello from Oregon. I'm Dick Morningstar, the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council, and I want to welcome all of our guests, whether in person or on Zoom, to the launch of our report, Securing the Energy Transition Against Cyber Attacks. And cyber threats, actually. So we're happy to have such a great crowd for this event. For the release of this, I think, incredibly important paper. I will be brief in my introduction, and we'll try to set the stage with maybe a few obvious points. First, the facts of life are that energy demand is going to continue to increase. And for that reason, digital infrastructure is going to increase exponentially. Although we can try to simplify systems, they will likely become more complex. And every new connection will create further opportunities for cyber criminals or rogue countries. And the critical task is for governments and the private sector to work together to develop a framework for cyber defense. And this has to be a public-private sector cooperative and coordinated approach to deal with these issues. And this is what the report is all about. And let me just say anecdotally, that an example, people have been surprised that Russia has not done more in Ukraine from the standpoint of cyber attacks. We may be underestimating that to some extent, and it may become more of a problem. But one of the reasons is that the US government, Microsoft, the Ukrainian government worked together to forge significant defenses against these cyber threats. This is the kind of cooperation that we're going to have. So I think I've basically exhausted what my thoughts are on the subject, and let me turn it over to the real experts. First, let me introduce the co-chairs of the task force, who will be part of a fireside chat in a minute or so. Secretary Michael Chertoff, the executive chair of the Chertoff Group, and as you all know, the former Secretary of Health and Human Services from 2005 to 9. And also wanting to welcome General Wes Clark, Chairman and CEO of the Wesley K. Clark and Associates, and former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. And I might add parenthetically that I remember very, very fondly working closely with Wes when he was Supreme Allied Commander and I was our ambassador to the EU at the same time. Now, let me turn it over to Andrew Gumbiner, the founder of AJG Strategies, who's going to moderate this discussion. And I'm certainly looking forward to hear Secretary Chertoff and General Clark's remarks.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Morningstar. I just want to start and say it's an honor to be here today moderating this discussion and to have the opportunity to work on this report as a rapporteur, a fancy word for writer. As the ambassador said, my name is Andrew Gumbiner. I run a public affairs firm here in Washington, D.C., and I'm a fellow at the Atlantic Council. Previously, I have more than a decade in government, working in the Obama administration as the spokesman for the Department of Energy. Before we kick things off, I want to thank the co-chairs, General Clark, Secretary Chertoff, for their invaluable guidance, leadership, and expertise through this report. I want to thank the Atlantic Council and all of the task force members for their time, resources, expertise, and input to produce what I believe is a critical and timely report to help secure and advance the energy transition. Finally, I want to send a special thanks to my co-rapporteurs who could unfortunately not be here today, Pedro Allende, John LaRue. This would not have been possible without countless hours of work, and I truly appreciate you being partners in that with me. So with those formalities out of the way, and with the ambassador giving introductions already, I want to give both General Clark and Secretary Chertoff a few minutes to give some opening remarks, frame the discussion. General Clark, since you're here in person, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to be here. And it's a real honor for me to work with Mike Chertoff on this, who's been a real leader in this from the time, really, that we got started into critical infrastructure. And so this is a really great team that we've had here. I want to say this by introduction. First of all, you all have not seen the report. And we're going to talk about the generalities and some specifics. But you must read this report. I've been on many study groups and I have seen countless reports. This is the best, single, meatiest, most timely, most in-depth but concrete proposals report I've ever seen. I mean, every sentence deserves consideration. There's no skimming over the report. You have to read every sentence because we're dealing with a subject here that is urgent, it's complicated, and it's semi-familiar to thousands and thousands of Americans and institutions, but it's constantly evolving. And so it's started with maybe 9/11 when we started the Critical Infrastructure Awareness Program, but for me it started in 1994. I was called in when I was the J5 over the Pentagon by the vice chairman. He said, shut the door. He said, look, there's something called network attack, and it doesn't have to be kinetic. At that time, we didn't even know what the difference between kinetic and non-kinetic was. And the internet was just getting started, Netscape was just coming out, and we realized this was something really big. So I was a J5, but I didn't get it. It went to the J3. And so when I was a NATO commander, we looked at using some of these capacities in that conflict. We didn't use them because it wasn't necessary and we didn't want to reveal them. But I guess it didn't matter because the Chinese came out in 1999 with a book called Unrestricted Warfare, written by two colonels, and it says everything's open to attack, and it talked about critical infrastructure. And after 9/11, we realized how vulnerable we were. So that's where really this comes from. And there are sort of three converging trends here. One is that industry continues to innovate and continues to seek more efficiency in its solutions. And so there's always a drive to hold down the cost of electricity. There's always a drive to then use technology to replace people and use modern technology to innovate systems. So there's continuing movement in the whole electricity sector. Secondly, what we discovered was that not only is the grid vulnerable to attack because it's got cyber and connections and people are on the internet with it and goes over the internet, there are windows, even if you have a virtual private network, there's windows you can get it. But we discovered that through bits and bytes, you can actually cause physical damage. And we proved it with Stuxnet. And it opened Pandora's box for us. And so the difference between IT and OT is something that's really important and significant to talk about. And I guess the third major trend is that we're going to have a more distributed energy architecture in the United States. We just can't help it. If we're going to go to renewable energy, we're going to do away with the sort of gigawatt coal-fired power plants that, like we used to have in Arizona at Four Corners, and we're going to end up with something else. A lot of it's net metering. A lot of it is smaller energy projects. And a lot of it is not under the control of the bulk electricity system. So I think these three factors, plus the international situation, make this a real urgent report. So we're going to get to the international situation in a minute. I want to stop there and ask Secretary Chertoff to come in.
Yeah, great.
We're having trouble hearing you, Secretary.
Thank you, General. Let me say, first of all, it's been a pleasure to co-chair this with you and with your amazing public service and tremendous experience in dealing with conflict. Andrew, you've been great as a rapporteur along with your colleagues, and it's been a very, very instructive and I think important effort to produce this report. I want to thank Ambassador Morningstar. A slight correction. I was not Secretary of Health and Human Services. I was Secretary of Homeland Security, which was in many ways an easier job, as we've learned.
I apologize. I obviously misspoke.
but it certainly gave me a vantage point to look at the security issues we're considering here, including the need to protect infrastructure. And as General Clark pointed out, we're living in a world now where the idea of energy as big power plants and everything being large scale really has been supplanted by a much more networked effect in terms of the way our energy is managed. And that's true not just with the IT, the information technology, but the operational technology. And as we've had a wider distribution, we've increased the surface area through which attacks can be carried out. We've also put more of the control systems in a remote setting, which means if you can disrupt the flow of information, you can make it impossible to control the physical environment. And all of this is only going to intensify. We've had the pandemic. We've had general technology as we're migrating now into more climate-friendly technology. And this is going to be a much more distributed grid and a much more distributed infrastructure. This is a particularly important time to talk about this because we are in the middle of a war. Russia has attacked Ukraine. Even prior to this physical attack in February, Russia did engage in cyber attacks on Ukraine, attacking their grid on a couple of occasions in the winter. There was the NotPetya ransomware attack. And although I think the ambassador is correct, we haven't seen the same scale of attacks yet, there have been attacks by the Russians, including by Russian surrogates, criminal groups that have launched, for example, denial of service attacks against allies of Ukraine like Lithuania. So this, I think, underscores the importance of making sure we're thinking strategically about our cybersecurity. And that brings me to my third point, which is, I think, a very important observation General Clark made. This report is very strategic. It talks about bringing all the tools in the toolbox together in order to make sure that we have both public and private coordination and strategy in terms of protecting our infrastructure. And we also need to be strategic in terms of considering all the elements of security. It's not just protecting your endpoints, but it involves the way you structure your network, how you build resilience, how you respond to attacks, how you warn of attacks, and how you exercise and train people. And so what this report does, I think very importantly, is talks about bringing together and unifying all of the disparate federal and private entities that have grown up around security so that everybody is operating off the same sheet of music. We have a common strategy, common standards. We have effective financing. We are able to vet and check our supply chain, and we are trained and exercised in terms of what to do if there's an attack. So I commend the report to anybody who's concerned about energy, and I turn it back over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So both of you touched on kind of where we are in this moment. We're seeing changes in real time. So before we kind of get into the details of the report, I want to dig in a little bit there. We have an evolving geopolitical landscape. Situation in Ukraine is extremely fluid, and we are learning a tremendous amount in a matter of months. The Colonial Pipeline attack taught us major lessons, probably brought the consequences of a major attack on U.S. critical infrastructure to the public's eyes like we haven't seen before. And then we're looking at the energy transition. We can see changes taking place at a rapid pace. So can you talk to us about how these events, even in just the past year and a half, Colonial Pipeline, COVID, obviously the conflict in Ukraine are changing how we are thinking about securing critical infrastructure. Have we learned lessons in just that short amount of time? Has it exposed gaps, allowed us to understand strengths? I'm going to start with General Clark here, and then we'll send it to the Secretary after.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Well, look, the truth is that it shouldn't have taken these events to bring us to this point. I mean, we have had study group after study group after study group look at things. But I will tell you that I'm very impressed with the current administration and what they're doing, because they have sort of looked at all the previous studies. They've got stuff moving in a way that previous administrations haven't done. I mean, we've been doing this since 2004, 2005, and yes, it keeps changing, but it was always clear that you have to have better coordination between government agencies. You have to have better reporting from the private sector. You have to have response plans set up and somebody designated to respond. And then it was clear that as you're moving forward, you have to have supply chain management and evaluation, and then you have to have some kind of feedback as to what industry's doing with it. Now, all these lessons were sort of brought out in the last 18 months. The Colonial Pipeline, for example, is a good example. Okay, it's a pipeline. It's not the grid. So, but it is controlled electronically through the grid, through the internet. And so it's managed separately. It's managed under TSA. And so TSA is different than, let's say, the federal FERC or NERC, and the way that bulk electricity systems manage, different reporting standards and different timelines. And under the bulk electricity system, I think you get like 1.8 hours to report this before they fine you $1 million. So if you're a big electric power generator, you're going to be on your toes. If anything happens, 2 o'clock in the morning, you're in there. It's not that way. It wasn't that way for the pipeline system. It was like, well, do you want to report? How bad is it? And what happens if we report it and everybody complains about us and we get sued by businesses? So all these liability issues, reporting issues came up. That's just one example. But you know, the only way we're going to fix this really is to stay on top of it, because not only do you have to have public attention, which the Ukraine war has helped us develop, but what you're bringing the attention to is constantly evolving underneath as new technology emerges, new business investments are made, and new threat attack vectors are developed. So
great. And Mr. Secretary, I think you bring a unique perspective because you have the long view of what DHS has done in this, and maybe you can give us some context there as well. You know, what has, what's changed in the past year and a half? What is it exposed?
Well, let me say in general, and of course I agree with what General Clark has said, but for quite a while now we knew at DHS, and then my successors knew, that the energy grid was a critical area of infrastructure to protect. I would say, frankly, that and the financial system are probably the two most attractive targets to bad actors. And the challenge, particularly with the electric grid and everything ancillary to that, is that when you deal with the big players, many of the utilities do understand they need to invest in cybersecurity and have worked closely with the government. But you also have a lot of small cooperatives or smaller entities that are part of the ecosystem, and they don't have the knowledge or the economic ability to raise their level of security. And so that's been a slower process. What the last year and a half has done, though, is underscore two things. First, because of COVID, hybrid and remote work is here to stay. It may move back somewhat to what we used to have, but the more remote work you have, the more distribution you need to have about energy. But even more significant, if you look at what's going on in the war in Ukraine now, you're beginning to see some of our allies in Europe getting a little bit fidgety about the sanctions we're putting on, because they're concerned that if the Russians cut off oil and cut off natural gas and other energy, they're going to wind up having a very cold winter. And believe me, the Russians understand that, and they're using their leverage over critical natural resources as a way of trying to push back on NATO unity of effort. They haven't been successful up to now, but that's not going away. What does that teach us? It teaches us, as DHS has publicly announced, that the Russians and other adversary nations may see an advantage in undermining and handicapping our current energy infrastructure, both in terms of what it's like in this country and what we're able to do to assist our allies. So essentially what's happened is the energy system has become part of the field of conflict that we're now seeing between Russians and maybe eventually the Chinese and what we call the Western liberal democracies.
Yep.
So this has now got to be, from a national security standpoint, a very big priority for the U.S. government. And I think part of what the report makes clear is much of the regulatory and security architecture we've built in the U.S., and frankly, including NATO, over the last few years was built episodically.
Yep.
The pieces don't necessarily fit together. There's overlap, there's duplication, there's even inconsistency. It's really time to sit down and map out what is our strategic architecture, what are the standards we should enforce and promote, and what are the training and planning exercises we have to engage in so that we can respond quickly.
Great, and so we're going to dive into that in a second, but I do want to I have a follow-up question. We talk about this a little bit in the report. The quick response from the U.S. government following the incident in Ukraine, the ongoing incident in Ukraine, was to launch a campaign from CISA called Shields Up, and that was a very, very quick campaign. We talked about it in some of our discussions on the task force, and that was, in many ways, we saw that as a model of what the type of response and coordination that we would need as geopolitics comes into play with domestic U.S. critical infrastructure. Can you both kind of shed some light, maybe starting with the Secretary, on how sustainable is that approach? I mean, is that something we're going to have to keep up? Would you say that was the right policy response, and from your view, how it's going?
Well, I think from a short-term standpoint, it's commendable to run in quickly with information, guidance, and requirements that can help the private sector know what they need to do. But of course, when you're dealing with cyber attacks, you're dealing with a dynamic threat. And also in the long term, you need to build investments in people and in technology and in infrastructure in order to raise the bar in general in terms of security. Those investments aren't going to happen instantaneously. I do think that money has been set aside to fund this, but even that's going to take a little while. And the other thing I would point out, which we've begun to really focus on, is your security is not just what you control.
Yeah.
But it has to depend upon what everybody who is part of your supply system also does. Because if they're not secure, you're not secure. If the people who come to, for example, to do the work on your power plants hook up their devices and the devices aren't secure and your plant gets infected with malware, that's your problem. So what we're seeing is that the area of concern for security is now spreading downstream as well as laterally. And that's, I think, got to be a more sustainable effort.
Yeah. Sir?
Well, I think what the Secretary said is very, very appropriate and right, and I associate myself with it. Look, on Shields Up, insofar as it involves cyber hygiene, it has to be sustained.
Yeah.
The fact is, just in the Ukraine case, we don't know what's going to happen with Ukraine.
Yep.
Right now, everybody seems to feel really good because we sent HIMARS over there, and you're reading in the press that we're destroying, fuel dumps or ammo dumps. Okay, so there's a sense of exultation about it, just like there. But we don't know what the real status is. Mm-hmm. Ukraine doesn't want to tell us what their real losses are, and Putin says he's going to continue to go for it. And so we don't know how this could evolve. Right. What we do know is that there has been something you could call interwar deterrence. There were some pretty significant threats made against the United States when this started and just before it started. Yep. And so Shields Up was an appropriate part of that response. The other parts of that response we're not going to talk about here. Sure. But that was part of it. But the thing is that We don't know where this is going to go, and Putin hasn't wanted to actually bring the full weight of the United States in. He's done everything he can to deter us from getting involved. Now, when he starts to lose more deeply on the battlefield, and it looks like it's about to go downhill, is he going to escalate? And how would he escalate? Who would he escalate against? Maybe it's, as Mike Chertoff says, he's going to really go after the European energy architecture, not only by cutting out gas, but by going after the electricity grid and doing everything he can to make the Europeans miserable. He probably sees that as the weak link in the whole near-term operation. We've got Xi Jinping going for a third term in China. All my sources say probably going to get it. Not unanimously supported, but he's probably going to get it. That frees him up to support Russia. So we don't know where this is going. So we have to keep shields up on. But we also have to do more than that. What we need is what one of your successors, Mike, started that I remember was something called See Something, Say Something. And I saw that plastered all over airports. Some people laughed about it. I think there was some kind of a late night comedy joke on it or skit on it. But the truth is, you have to have your best defense are the people that work for you.
Yep.
They see the system at close hand every day. And if they're really tuned in, they understand what the vulnerabilities are. And if you can get them on board in a whistleblower context, so they're willing to say to the boss, this is really weak. We haven't changed passwords in a year.
Yep.
You got a password here. Well, like SolarWinds, the password was, what was it? Password 1234 or something like that.
Yep.
And so, that is something insiders can help us with. We don't need a national program that puts money in. We need a national program of awareness of the threat. And so those are some of the things I've picked up.
Great. Well, I want to jump into kind of the heart of this discussion, kind of the key thesis of what I think the report was all about. This issue really breaks down the interconnected relationship between government and the private sector. I think it's a defining feature of both the challenges and the solutions of how we're going to solve this. So we talk about really needing a new framework to secure the energy transition. It has to reconcile the government's responsibility for the country's national and economic security on the one hand, but we have to grapple with the fact that the majority of energy infrastructure in the United States is owned by the private sector and operated by the private sector. So how do we balance? I think we try to put forward a framework, building up a new framework to balance that's going to be geared towards the energy transition. So can you talk, maybe starting with Secretary Chertoff, what are some of the key recommendations, the key things that we can do in the near term and then in the long term? And I'll ask the general the same question of what we can do to build this new framework.
Well, there are a number of different things. Let me just focus on a few, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Obviously, much of the regulatory and government authority structure has built up over time in a way that was not focused on cyber issues. You have the Department of Energy, and that was formed a few decades ago. You had DHS even more recently. You have state regulators. You have federal energy regulators. It gets to be a little bit sometimes in the cyber arena like kids playing soccer and they chase the ball, they don't play their position. So the question is, how do you build a plan and a structure that is orderly, that takes account of the expertise that particular agencies develop, but make sure we have a unity of effort? And in this case, the report suggests that what the president really want to do is rationalize the incident response structure, have DHS and in particular CISA coordinate across the board, and then have particular obligations that fall within the competence of the Department of Energy and the states and FERC. So that's one level of progress that can be made. Second, we need to also have common standards. It's easy to say have security, but a lot of times the private sector says, well, what do I do? What's my priority? And so building a framework that lays out a common set of standards, using the work, for example, that NIST has done with the Department of Commerce, but also getting even a little bit more operational, again, is an important part of raising the general level of reducing the risk. Third is information sharing. The truth is, much of what the government can bring to the table is advance intelligence about something that's coming. And I know CISA tries to do that, and sometimes the FBI puts out bulletins, but actually building real-time coordination with the ability to make sure information passes at an operational speed and not at a policy speed. As we get into a more dynamic cyber environment, that becomes very, very important. And then finally, related to how we deal with an attack, is we need to build with the private sector incident response plans that identify the resources we need, the training we need, and then exercises it. You know, when you're playing a big game like the World Series, you don't want to meet your teammates for the first time on game one. You want to have played with them for a while. And I think that's what we need to do here. So that's just a selection of some of the things the report talks about.
Yeah, thank you. General?
So, first of all, everything the Secretary says is absolutely spot on. So what can we add to that? Well, first of all, I think we have to go back into the policy side and look back at our presidential decision directives and how we got to this point. There's obsolescent stuff in there that has been superseded by people get better ideas, they put a new organization together, and then it doesn't get cleaned up from the previous recommendation, and so it leads to confusion. So I think the executive branch has some homework to do on some of the PDDs and the structuring. It's what Mike says about the clean response. It also has to do with sort of setting the standards. Who sets the standards? How is it checked? And then who's in charge of the response? I think Congress also has a role to play in this, because Congress, one of my experiences with Congress, I've been since the 1970s working with this, and I mean, Congress likes to get its hands on things. And so you've got lots of different committees that have a piece of this, and different agencies have a piece of it, and there's a budget fight on it, and so there's a natural tendency to sort of quibble over roles and missions and what authorities there are and try to go after budget. Some of that's good. I don't think you can try to take all this and put it under one person. If you do, you're going to make a mistake. With this inter-administrative, little bit of competition, a little bit of, hey, went to a meeting, did you think of this? And if you do it in the right way, you get a stronger team. But there's some obsolescent stuff. And I want to talk about training, because training is really the way, and the exercises are really the way this comes out. You have to exercise this program with the latest technology on the threat. You have to have a realistic scenario on your homeland security and bring this in, and then you've got to take the lessons from it, learn them, and incorporate them. And you have to have a live process that does this. And you need to involve, every couple of years, the very top people in government at the secretary level, and the vice president or president needs to see this. Because if they don't see what happens at the bottom and the confusion and so forth, and get the hot wash on it, you don't get the emphasis on it. To me, this whole area reminds me of what we did in the Army starting in the 1980s to come out of the Vietnam War. We put together a training program, and we exercised the training program. We did lessons learned from it. We went through it again and again and again and again. This is not cost-free. So we have to make sure that we put the right resources into the exercise and take the right lessons out of it. It's too easy. This is a capital-intensive sector. So it's too easy to put the money into, let's buy another piece of equipment, rather than let's put another $100 million into a really robust exercise. We've got something now called, I think, e-Citric, where we're actually able to bring items in the supply chain out, test them, and then build an exercise around it. And this is the kind of stuff that has to be done again and again and again, because everything's always changing.
Great. Well, we're running out of time for this piece. It's shocking that we have condensed so much from the report into one conversation after a year of working.
Can I just say one thing?
Please.
And I know Mike wants to say something too. Before you cut us off, look, we're not going to get rid of the private sector in the energy and power business. We're not going to make it all under the federal government. We're not going to take over small utilities. We're not going to get rid of state regulation for the utility industry. Can't do it. Too big. Wouldn't work. You have to make incremental changes in this business. But the incremental change is this. If you're going to put higher standards on for cyber security, both for IT and OT, you're going to have to resource it. And this means the federal government's going to have a greater responsibility to help the widely distributed participants in the power sector fund what they need to keep the country secure.
Yep.
There's just no other way to do it. It will come with more regulation, but otherwise, you're just going to raise electricity rates and people will fight you at the Public Utilities Commission.
Yep.
So I think if there's a, we love the technology, we love the fact that solar is cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, even with Chinese panels, but we're not going to get the security we need unless we put the resources in at the federal level and then focus them down on the people that have got to innovate.
So let me give the Secretary a last word here to give a couple closing comments for us.
Well, I'm in very strong agreement with what Wes Clark just said. I think he's absolutely correct. I would simply say this: we're talking about in the report energy transition. We're at an inflection point where there's a great deal of interest in moving to a more sustainable form of energy. That may involve reviving technologies that at one point became disfavored, like nuclear, and coming up with safer ways to operate that. But all of that's going to require confidence and security in the architecture of what we're building. So this is a moment where we actually can combine two virtues: the virtue of our security and the virtue of protecting our climate and our world. And this has to be a partnership between the public and the private sector. And I hope Congress will get on board with funding and supporting this very, very important effort.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for working with us on the task force, for leading the task force, being here today.
It's been a real privilege. And again, please just read this report. It is really, really good.
I second that for sure. So we're going to take a quick break, 5 minutes, just to have our next panel come on. So for those of you online, please hang tight, and we'll be back shortly.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, great pleasure and honor to be working with you. Thank you. Thanks for your leadership on this. Thank you.
General, and have a safe and happy summer and stay engaged with us. You are a wise man.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks to you and the Rob.
thank you all for joining us for this report launch today. My name is Nick Anderson. I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. I'm also the COO of Invictus International Consulting here in the National Capital Region. And I'm a former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. We have a distinguished panel here with us today to discuss this important topic. And as we progress with the discussion today, I'd like to remind all of our virtual audience members that they can submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function. We'll be able to see that here for our Q&A portion in about 30 minutes with our panel members. Likewise, for our in-person audience members, we're going to have the opportunity for the iPad to be passed around for Q&A to be submitted that way. As has been previously discussed by the Secretary and the General in our opening panel with Andrew, we really have an energy system that's in transition. We've seen that over the last several years. We've seen the tangible effects of these transitions and the tangible effects of both natural hazards and cybersecurity events. We've seen the extended long-term effects of rebuilding infrastructure in Puerto Rico. We've seen rolling blackouts in California 2 years ago. We've seen the continued energy conservation issues with Texas as recently as just this week, as well as the cybersecurity effects that we've seen with ransomware incidents affecting the Colonial Pipeline, as was mentioned earlier. These natural and even more traditional energy planning issues are only compounded by the fact that back in 2019, we highlighted in the Worldwide Threat Assessment that countries such as China and Russia already possess the ability to temporarily disrupt U.S. energy critical infrastructure using cyber means and to be able to hold it hostage, to execute those plans at a time and place of their choosing. This really makes this report all that much more timely and all that much more critical for us to consider all aspects of securing our energy critical infrastructure as it is in transition. Now, securing the energy transition really requires aligning those complex federal policies, bureaucracies, and the programs to secure critical infrastructure from cyber attacks and meet the needs of this evolving threat. U.S. cyberspace strategy and federal energy policy was really never meant to act in such a cohesive manner to secure critical infrastructure in this way. And this report envisions a more balanced approach to connecting those communities and bringing together the public and private sector. So with this esteemed panel, I'd like to give some introductions here. Neil Chatterjee is a former commissioner and chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and is a senior advisor at Hogan Lovells. Megan Samford is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative and is a vice president and chief product security officer at Schneider Electric. Leo Simonovich is vice president and global head of industrial cyber and digital security at Siemens Energy. And Adrian Lotto is the vice president and chief risk and resilience officer for the New York Power Authority, or NYPA, and is the former principal deputy assistant secretary of energy for cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response. Thank you all for joining us here today. So I'd like to start with you, Leo. Scaling, monitoring, and detection solutions through these public-private partnerships is a real challenge, but it's also a unique opportunity to expand capabilities in the environment. Can you talk to us a little bit about your perspective from Siemens?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks again to the Atlantic Council and to the task force. It's been a pleasure to work on this report. It raises a number of important issues, but at the core of this is the rapid change that's driven by a push towards a more distributed, cleaner energy system. And the same digital technologies that are helping us achieve those outcomes are also greatly expanding the attack surface. The challenge, of course, is as we are building the plane as we fly it. We have the brownfield environment, we have digital native technologies, and it's with this complexity that many utilities are struggling to get their hands around the issue of industrial cyber operational technologies. And it begins with understanding of that risk, but to better understand the risk, you have to be able to detect, to understand your exposure. And yet, many utilities today are operating blind. They don't have the capabilities to be able to adopt many of these technologies. And that has to do with three things. First, it has to do with the fact that many of these technologies have fancy words like AI attached to them. And we as an industry are safety focused. And that means by adopting new and emerging technologies, we don't understand what's in the black box. So we have to really get faster at consuming those technologies at scale. The second is we have to make them cheaper and reduce the cost curves of adopting of those monitoring technologies, would give us visibility, give us that context, empower insights, help us understand the risk better. And then the third thing we got to do is we have to bring those technologies down the supply chain and to small and medium-sized enterprises, which often struggle with putting budgets in place to address operational technologies, let alone go after some of the more sophisticated tools that are out there. We need to get leverage into the system.
Absolutely. Now, Adrian, you used to be at DOE. Now you're with a utility. Can you speak a little bit about how these partnerships today play a role in the cyber threat landscape and how you see those sort of partnerships playing out with your perspective?
Yeah, sure. And again, thank you to the Atlantic Council for having us here today. So partnerships are extremely important in this space. We're very fortunate to have a number of robust partnerships that we're already utilizing, things like the Electric Subsector Coordinating Council, which brings together partners in both industry, federal government, and utilities of all sizes, whether they're IOUs, munis, or co-ops. But partnerships need to continue to develop both at the state level as well as some of the changes that are happening at the energy structure in the energy security field today. So as was mentioned earlier by some of our speakers, making sure that, for example, we have partners, and we do, and we're continuing to evolve those partnerships both with the ISACs, the DNG ISAC, the downstream natural gas ISAC, the LNG. So we want to continue to, as the generation mix, the portfolio mix continues to evolve and change, those partners need to come along so that we are continuing to evolve and keep the flow of information going. And certainly now, last but not least, but continuing to keep security at the forefront of all of those discussions. That's a critical role in terms of energy security.
Yeah, thanks so much. I absolutely agree. I mean, it's important to kind of keep those relationships in mind. You mentioned several other groups that are out there that are helping to perform some of that public-private coordination role. Neil, I was wondering, because you've seen a lot of the different impacts across the sector, and there's a public component to what we've done in government, but there's also a huge private sector component. The private sector owns the infrastructure. The private sector actions what's required to strengthen the resilience of our critical infrastructure. And the private sector has to maintain the cyber hygiene, the supply chain threat awareness. I was wondering if you could highlight for us, what are some of the new policy and market solutions that are needed to incentivize cybersecurity that can really scale technologies and solutions along with this energy transition and the new business model that we're seeing?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you also to the Atlantic Council for not just hosting this forum, but for really putting out this very timely report. This is something that just recently, as a few years ago, when I was at FERC, I think people thought I was being hyperbolic when I said that the landscape of 21st century warfare had evolved to such a point that now private sector companies found themselves on the front lines of that warfare. And people said to me, well, Neil, what does that mean? And I said, the reality is no one can match the United States of America when it comes to militaristic strength, but they don't have to if a cyber attack or a physical attack on critical energy infrastructure, that type of attack can have the same national security and economic security impact as a military style attack. And I use the example of the Colonial Pipeline, and it's a visceral one, but that ransomware attack, if the Colonial Pipeline had been taken out by a missile, it didn't have any different economic or national security impact, but I'm not sure we were programmed to respond in the same way. And I think there's a recognition there that policy and coordination between the government and the private sector needs to evolve to meet this challenge. There are clearly gaps. My agency, FERC, my former agency, we were responsible for evaluating the siting of pipeline infrastructure, but we didn't have the authority for overseeing the security of that pipeline infrastructure. That fell to TSA. Something as basic as getting a security clearance. I was briefed by the CEO of a pipeline company that said that he had been briefed by ODNI that his system was vulnerable, but nobody in his company even had a high enough clearance to gain access to the TSSCI level briefing necessary to know where to invest to protect the system. And so there are things that we need to do. Standards, FERC working closely with NERC. FERC has jurisdiction over the bulk electric system. That's important, but what about distribution? You have huge swaths of the country that aren't subject to the standards that FERC and NERC work together on. I look back, prior to FERC developing these standards, NERC had actually made a filing at FERC and looked to create cybersecurity standards for the bulk electric system. Perhaps it's time to contemplate something like that today for distribution. Maybe FERC itself, or could direct NERC to come up with standards that would apply to distribution, to demand response in terms of market participation. And then we also need to look at economic incentives, whether through rate base, through tax incentives. We have to find a way to better align the public and private approach to this so that it makes sense and be nimble and evolve.
Absolutely. I mean, especially, as you put it, this is about for other countries seeking to gain an advantage. This is asymmetric threat advantage in a war that was really never declared. So when we think about some of the things that public sector can do right in this space, especially in a space where we're so heavily dependent on private sector entities, regulations are only really going to be able to achieve so much. But I feel like standards, vulnerability threat assessments, supply chain and equipment testing programs are some of those elements where we can see the successes of public sector involvement in this space. Megan, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you think that standards could help to fill some of these gaps as we see the energy transition continuing to evolve.
Sure, and thank you so much for the question, Nick. And it's awesome to be back here again today with the Atlantic Council. I hate to kind of pull from Winston Churchill here, but we need steady administration, right? We need the hard work of putting security features into products and systems, and we need a standard like IEC 62443 that has been proven, it's been used, it's been debated for the past decade or so, and it was a standard that was created for engineers by engineers. And where I would say standards like 62443 come into play is that it takes the equities of all stakeholders into account, meaning it's very specific in saying to someone that may just be starting on their cyber journey, like a few of the panelists were citing earlier, that many of the critical infrastructure owners and operators, they're just beginning. And in many cases, they don't even know where to start. They look to the NIST risk management framework, and we tell people that is a wonderful place to start to begin to identify and understand and develop strategy to buy down your risk. But if you're looking for something very operational that's going to give you direct kind of practical advice on day one, direct it to asset owners, system integrators, which are often left out of the equation, as well as equipment manufacturers, suppliers like my company, it's 62443. It's going to tell you what needs to be done at each level by the different parties invested. And it's going to show you over time how you could move from maybe a security level 1, which is a very basic level of security that everyone should have, all the way up to very sophisticated levels of security that we would expect to see from nation state attacks at security level 3 and security level 4. So I hate to kind of be boring about it, but there's no silver bullets to this. But what I can say is that we're probably quite a few years behind the process automation industry that has been following the standard successfully for many years. And if we were to just draw a line in the sand and say we're not chasing silver bullets any longer, we're going to depend on implementation of a standard and we're going to measure performance against the compliance of that standard, then I think in a few years we may be sitting across from you having a much different and quite frankly more calibrated discussion.
Yeah, my only gripe with you, Megan, is 62443 doesn't really roll off the tongue. We need some sort of cool energy sector cyber jingle to go along with it. T-shirts have to be made, wristbands have to be marketed and handed out at conferences. Otherwise, I don't know that it's going to be successful. Maybe that's the standards problem.
I think we need a rock band.
62443 rock band. This is a group that I would listen to.
Oh, maybe that says something about all of our lives. Okay. It's all serious. Sorry, we're bringing it back into the serious now. There's really no cohesive system that we have for really coordinating cybersecurity for the energy system. There's no coordinated system for really getting 100% visibility. Like Neil mentioned, even if we focus our efforts on the bulk electric system, there's still a large amount of owners and operators that are left out of that discussion, and that's even if we're just focusing the conversation on electric. If we're not focusing it on everything else, some of the elements that Adrian was mentioning earlier with our oil and natural gas community. Many of those public and private entities over many decades kind of helped contribute to creating this really complex, interdependent, interconnected system. So as digitization continues to expand the attack surface here, we really need to find ways to disrupt those traditional roles and responsibilities of utilities. Leo, I was hoping you could give us what I'm sure will be an incredibly easy answer about who is responsible for all of this, who is responsible for securing assets from attacks, and ultimately, who should pay for security?
Oh boy. Well, I think to Neil's point, it is about shared responsibility, and that shared responsibility begins with having clear ownership. In many utilities, that ownership for operational technology is bifurcated between the folks that run the plants and the IT security teams. I think one of the best things we could do is encourage defining a unified operating model between those two functions within the organizations, and then helping develop roadmaps that drive change, not just in creating better hygiene, but also in creating a more innovative approach to driving adoption of technology. Megan talked about standards. Standards need to align with incentives, which then need to align with ownership. And when we have clear ownership, then it's sort of like, as Henry Kissinger said, when you want to talk to Europe, who do you talk to? I think once we have that clear ownership, we can begin to identify all the stakeholders in the ecosystem. We as Siemens Energy believe that, we're the glue in the supply chain in the same way that Schneider is, and increasingly IT providers like Microsoft, for example, are as well. So we all need to come together. We all need to take a risk-based approach, and then we need to incentivize adoption of some of the core capabilities across the organization. I think small and medium-sized enterprises are going to have the hardest time doing that because it sounds just too fancy, right? I mean, it's just too much like either consultant speak or compliance jargon, and we need to get to a point where we're offering practical solutions to those operators and assigning ownership to them.
Absolutely, and I think one of the important things that you mentioned is that risk-based approach, because everybody's risk is going to look a little bit differently. Where they're operating is going to look a little bit differently. The constituency that they're serving is a little bit different. We really have, especially in this sector, kind of a special trust and confidence that the public has trusted the energy sector to just always be there, to always be delivering, no matter what, all the time. We see the impacts in our community when it doesn't happen, whether it's because of a cyber attack or because of a natural hazard. But with that risk-based approach and understanding that everybody has a little bit of a different perspective, Adrian, I was hoping you could highlight for us a little bit of the state and local perspective here and talk about what that looks like and kind of how you're seeing that play out inside of NYPA and then inside of sort of that public power community.
So I agree with a lot of the comments that have already been stated. I think it is critically important for each utility to understand what their risk tolerance is, what their risk appetite is specific to the cyber threat landscape, and then to develop cyber-layered defenses around those tolerance and those limits. But speaking specifically regarding states, I think it's critically important that state energy policy and state energy policy makers and offices continue to embed. You see a lot of RFPs getting issued out by states, and you see a lot of policies being made at the state levels that are focused on decentralizing the grid, clean energy, but they tend to be devoid of embedding cybersecurity. The RFP will literally say nothing about how it's going to be connected, what the cyber architecture will look like. And so I think for policymakers to understand when they are issuing those types of documents, that it's critically important that cybersecurity be embedded into those programs, those policies at the very outset. Specifically relative to DOE and coordination, I know the report touches upon overall the unified approach at the federal government level, but even within DOE, we have there's a department, EERE, that is fundamentally in charge of renewable energy, solar, wind, and the like. And then we have our former office, although not at the same time, the CSER office for cybersecurity, energy security. Again, they are just ensuring robust coordination among those two offices so that as the energy transition of the future occurs, even what's coming out of the U.S. federal government should have robust cybersecurity practices in it. So from whether it's at the federal level, I know our previous two speakers spoke a lot about policies, authorities, incentives, education, training, and exercises. All of those things, while existing at the state level, it depends on what state, different maturity levels exist within different state governments. So just ensuring that some of that same consideration, the same thought that went into the report relative to the federal government should be applied at the state level as well.
And I think, Megan, you've had some experience working with people, whether it's through their grant recipients and they're trying to figure out what is it I should be looking at and how should I best take advantage of this? Or it's with some of those RFPs that Adrian was mentioning that are coming out. I guess what are some of your lessons learned from going through that, or what is some of your advice to people in that space as they're making these considerations?
Sure, and thank you, Nick, and thank you, Adrian, for commenting on this topic at the state level. It's an important level that often gets left out of the discussions. So when I led critical infrastructure protection for the Commonwealth of Virginia, the governor's office or the state administrative agent, most of the time it's either with the governor's office itself or the Department of Emergency Management at the state level, they are intaking tons of federal level policy. They're trying to digest and interpret that policy at the state level, and it's being executed through state level critical infrastructure protection plans or different grant vehicles through the state agencies. And the most basic way that I can say it is that in many cases, they don't know how to write an RFP for cybersecurity. If you doled out the grant funding, I don't think that we should assume that there are tons of people at the state level that know how to write a correct RFP for a very complex solar system or building management system or any type of system that's being deployed that contributes to sustainability or the energy transition. Do not assume that officials at the state level know how to write those requirements or they know what to purchase, or even when they go to do a purchase, they don't know how to tell a good system and solution from a bad one. And so I think that that's a very common problem, and I don't think that it's their fault, but it's definitely there, and so we shouldn't make assumptions at the state level.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that perspective from your previous role. So Neil, what does the energy industry need from government to help to secure this more decentralized, digitized infrastructure and this new business model? And how can the private sector also help to contribute to a more collaborative framework?
Yeah, look, I think it's a couple of fold. I think what the energy industry needs from government right now is honestly the federal energy offices that have been allocated money to work in this regard need to get the money and to actually start applying it. There is money that is out there from various policy acts, from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was signed into law earlier this year, from various appropriations bills. And to the extent that that money is not getting into the right hands, folks are at a standstill. And I think, it is the responsibility of the government side to get its house in order to begin to provide that support to the private sector. In terms of, collaboration, I think we have been talking a lot about public-private partnerships. I think we need to look at public-private partnerships with international entities. And, currently the process is so cumbersome and bureaucratic, particularly working with the State Department to try and identify an international entity and vet it and get it cleared and be in a position to begin to work this kind of partnership. Our allies overseas are way ahead of us in this regard. And I think to the extent that we can streamline that process and focus more on building these kinds of relationships, I think we can all kind of work together to collaborate on this. Some of this, and I think it ties back to some of the challenges we're seeing at the state and local level as well, is this is just new to those of us in the energy space. For a government entity like FERC that historically has been targeted with, tasked with overseeing the reliability of the bulk electric system, to contemplate security threats to the level that we are today as a significant threat to reliability, this is just something new to the industry. During my tenure at the commission, we didn't even have a SCIF to house secured information. We had to go to DOE to get it. We didn't have the capability to have it. We didn't have people with clearances in the building. So I think part of this is also for the government side, as well as working with the private sector, is just some growing pains that I think we'll eventually work through. I really credit DOE and ESCC for starting to build those bonds between DHS, DOE, FERC, other agencies, as well as the private sector, but a lot more work needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And the public and private sectors sort of lack a unified strategic framework for securing energy infrastructure against cyber threats. The existing authorities intended to clarify responsibilities between a lot of those entities you just mentioned, between DHS, between DOE, between the sector and the owners and operators themselves. But really, those sort of gaps in jurisdiction and gaps in process coordination sometimes lead to things getting missed. And they lead to missed opportunities for us, or they lead to instances where we're all knocking on the same door of a private sector owner operator, or a manufacturer, or an integrator, or a partner out in that space, looking for opportunities to try to close some of those gaps. Those are really missed opportunities for timely information sharing and missed opportunities for working more closely together when the time comes. I can't remember if it was the secretary or the general who made the analogy. You don't want to be playing with the team for the first time when you're going onto the field. It's sort of the same thing here within cybersecurity, within the energy sector, as we're seeing all these different agencies come together. Megan, this has been something you've done a lot of work on. How do we encourage information sharing and collective defense required for meeting the needs, specifically here within the energy sector, as we continue to see this transition occur?
Sure. So thank you for the question again. I think that people immediately jump to information sharing as a gap and a need, and it's something that people repeatedly ask for more information sharing on. Since 9/11, and when you look at after action reports, lack of information sharing or lack of the information getting into the right hands. I mean, it's always like within the top 5 of the lessons learned, but the purpose of information in my mind should never just be information sharing for information sharing. Sharing of information is needed to give decision makers maneuver room. That's really the true purpose of information sharing, is to give those decision makers time to adjust plans, to make calls, to shore up response plans, and really to give time for a framework to mature where you have confidence that entities that you're sharing information with, as that information is propagated through a very large state machine of critical infrastructure, that a coordinated effort will come together to successfully respond and have critical mass to fight whatever it is you're up against. I would argue that we have lots of information sharing, and I can tell you within the past 18 months, I've seen tremendous efforts made by Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and others where they said, we're going to declassify information, we're going to share it. And I can tell you that I'm willing to bet that attacks on the homeland have been stopped as a result of the efforts just within the past 18 months. Okay, so number one, credit is due there to DHS and DOE on that. I will say, though, what I really think is lacking is it's 2 aspects. It's a framework aspect and it's a cultural aspect. So we'll start with the framework. I stood up a program called Incident Command System for Industrial Control Systems to really drive home the points that Secretary Chertoff and General Clark brought home earlier, in that we need a way to interact with the government. If the war is being brought to the private sector, then there has to be a consistent framework that's used for the private sector to interact with the government. And so far, the best framework that I've found that has worked collectively in the industry since the 1970s has been the Incident Command System. And so if it's one thing the United States does very well, despite as much criticism that can go around on any topic, it's emergency management, it's firefighting, it's natural disasters. We have done a good job here, and I think that we need to take some of the principles of those common frameworks, like within the incident command system, such as roles and responsibilities, authorities, delegations, span of control. All of these are items and frameworks that are provided to get people to work together in a way where everyone has a role and they're able to play that role, and you don't have 70 people kind of, running around not being very efficient. So we have frameworks that we can use. We can have information sharing. And on the point of culture, Leo frequently brings up, and he's right, that we need to double check the legal protections that are in place to ensure that information is flowing, and it's flowing with the right legal protections in place. And generally, there's a certain amount of psychological safety, both for individuals as well as organizations. But at the end of the day, when we talk about the culture of this information sharing and legal protections and all of these things, we have to drive home the point that culture is about the behaviors that an organization promotes, as well as the behaviors that an organization punishes. And so I think that eventually we're going to need some type of whistleblower protection laws in place to help companies and individuals when they want to come forth with information that could very well support national security.
Absolutely agree. And you know what, ICS also has the added benefit of rolling off the tongue a lot easier than 62443. So.
Well, at least I accomplished that. I'll work on 62443 though.
All right. Well, yeah, it is 4:45 now. We're going to transition to the audience Q&A portion of our discussion here today. We're also going to welcome Andrew back onto the stage with this panel. He has already given you a much better introduction of himself than I could ever do justice, both with his private and public sector work, so I'm not even going to try. We're just going to jump right in to one of the issues that I think kind of gets to the heart of the report. And again, for our virtual attendees, please do feel free to submit those questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. Our first question is, you can't depend on energy systems that are dependent on the climate or weather conditions. We don't need to be more dependent on unpredictable components in our future energy systems. Availability and reliability have been the hallmark of great energy systems, and it needs to remain that way. We have to synergistically integrate our energy systems, which means being more dependent on cyber systems that enables that integration. Comments? There's a whole lot to unpack there. So why don't we start perhaps with the intermittent resources conversation of the energy transition, and then talk about cyber issues associated with that.
I mean, I can touch on that a little bit just from having had a front row seat to the energy transition from my time at FERC. Look, innovative new technologies, cleaner energy technologies, as the business case for cleaner resources has improved, coupled with consumer demand, we're just seeing greater deployment of these technologies. And I think digitization is only accelerating that deployment. And I think America has benefited tremendously from it, economically and in terms of efficiency, as well as environmentally. These are cleaner sources of energy. But as Leo said in his initial kickoff, in doing so, you potentially do broaden the field of cyber threats. And so all of the benefits of that innovation and digitization come with this additional challenge of requiring better cyber preparedness. But that's why I think what is being discussed in this report and what we've been discussing today helps us to that. I completely agree with the questioner that we cannot take our eyes off of reliability, and that is what makes the challenges around the energy transition so complicated is that we must deal with the reality that climate change is threatening the grid, that cyber attacks are threatening the grid, that we must undergo this energy transition to deal with the impacts of climate change, but in a way that doesn't sacrifice reliability, doesn't increase cyber vulnerability, and also maintains affordability as well. We can do that, but it is going to take, a serious study, collaboration, and cooperation, as has been discussed today.
And just to pick up on that, I mean, clearly the energy system is under strain from multiple forces that are driving the need for greater resilience. And the question is, and not to sound like a broken record, but if there are technologies that are available today to help us build resiliency, then why are we so shy at adopting them? Think about cloud, for example, for operational technology. Those use cases exist, and they're already being deployed on the renewable side, but not necessarily on the bulk electric system. So, and yet because of the regulatory framework, there's a lot of hesitancy in adopting cloud. It could make us a lot more secure. It could drive better outcomes. And yet, almost every utility I talk to, it's considered a no-go zone. So we got to figure out how to deal with these big challenges and help address them. And Adrian, I'd be curious from your point of view as you think about some of this adoption of emerging tech and to build resiliency. What does the journey look like?
I think we've touched on several aspects of it. One, the security aspect, but two, the business case, right? I think sometimes we tend to separate. It's been touched on slightly vis-a-vis incentives. We keep using that word. But incentives take different forms for different types of utilities. So I think, some in the audience or others virtually may not understand that the grid is made up of different types of utilities that have different frameworks and regulations that apply or do not apply to them. And then they have different ways in which whether it's a rate-making case or other mechanisms by which they bill their customers and make money. So I think, yes, there's a security aspect of it, but there's a business aspect of it as well. We often talk about the grid being decentralized now, and how when it used to be a power plant, well, it's really easy to project, or somewhat easier to project a centralized location, and how the DER world is much more distributed. The question ultimately becomes, as you're moving towards the energy future, what happens to that $180 million plant that's sitting there that you've invested in that has that operational technology? Are you just simply writing that off? Probably not. So I think the transition, while it's also, there's an operational element that we've touched on here today, there's also an economic element. And what was spoken about earlier is fundamentally trying to keep energy prices for customers low while ensuring resiliency and reliability first and foremost of the grid is that ultimate challenge.
So with that changing mix of distributed energy resources, I'm guessing you're in the camp of thinking that there are going to be more and a continuing adoption of distributed energy resources. How does that really change the cyber attack surface, though, for the energy sector?
I think it changes it tremendously, both in terms of visibility and partner. We talked about it a little earlier in terms of partnerships. Again, a lot of the partnerships that exist currently are, again, at that state level, at the federal level, but now we're talking about introducing, turbine companies and solar companies, and again, to that supply chain perspective, right? You're introducing new partners into businesses. So understanding who are subject to a completely different regulatory framework or none at all, depending on what it is. So again, understanding that the threat surface is going to continue to grow. We need to have things like endpoint detection. We need to continue to have things like working closely together with these new partners, bringing them into things potentially and conversations like the ESCC perhaps, is perhaps a consideration. So I think it's just an ever-evolving threat as things continue to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So I've got two questions I'm going to combine into one because I know we are time limited here. So given the current focus on supply chain and cybersecurity, how can utilities best engage with manufacturers and distributors to make sure everyone understands supply chain risk management, which is remarkably similar to someone who has ESP with our other audience member, with consumers need greater visibility into software supply chain risk. Are DER and device manufacturers willing to provide customers with SBOMs as software bill of materials and vulnerability disclosure reports prior to procurement?
Can I direct that to Megan?
Or this one.
Go for it.
Sure.
I'm happy to.
I mean, I don't have any hesitancy in answering that question. And on the last question, I would, also add that the redundancy built into the system is good. And we're seeing microgrids at military bases, and that's providing redundancy within the system. So I think that there are multiple ways of viewing the problem without it being, mutually exclusive, that we're going to sacrifice security. I think that Leo was pulling the thread there, that maybe with cloud security and other advances in the future, maybe we can challenge that paradigm to where we can even have better security through better visibility and traceability, which is a great segue into SBOMs, because at the heart of SBOMs, what customers are really asking us for is transparency. And Schneider Electric is a very public supporter of software bill of materials. And, in terms of meeting customer requirements for providing that information, yes, I think the industry is well down that road. In terms of a transactional two-way conversation, what we would want to see more of from customers is if manufacturers step up to the plate and they provide more information on their open source usage, their SBOMs, everything that the product is made of. If we give you that recipe, do you have an asset inventory that you can slap it up against to where you can actually use it? That's what I'm worried about. Is SBOMs are great, but my heart is going to break if we do all this work in SBOMs and then nobody's actually using it because they're not confident in their asset inventory. And there's tons of tooling out there in the IT environment. Obviously, this has been solved for in many ways with CMDB databases and things like that. But on the IT side, they've had an accurate track of the assets that they have. They know how to patch. That's kind of old news for them. For us on the OT side, customers, it's very hard for them. In many cases, they actually have to walk a plant floor or a facility to figure out what is this product, when did we buy it, what version is it running on, because the technology today, while there are great technologies coming out that will give you an idea of your asset inventory, this is not a trivial exercise, especially if customers have hundreds of sites that have thousands of products within them. And so again, when we talk about the relationship between manufacturers and customers and how can we work better together, I look at a standard like 62443, and it's going to be very direct when we say that we're delivering a product at security level 2. You know exactly what you're purchasing, exactly the capability of the product, nothing more and nothing less. And on the end user side, as a manufacturer, we have expectations of the care of that product over its lifetime and how the customer may be interacting and hopefully updating that product over time and certainly deploying it in a secure way. My biggest gripe, if I could say anything, or my wish list from this is just let's get the devices off the internet. I mean, I think if we were to do like another 100-day sprint of just get everything off of the internet, we would have a huge amount of surface attack reduction within the United States critical infrastructure community. So again, SBOMs are great. We'd love to see customers have an asset inventory and get your stuff off the internet.
Some great recommendations. So we're going to turn our attention actually specifically to one of the recommendations from the report. Given your first recommendation, clarifying DHS CISA's role as leader of the National Unity of Effort for Critical Infrastructure Protection, what is the ideal relationship between CISA and DOE in terms of ownership of energy sector cybersecurity? How do we achieve that ideal relationship while also balancing personalities and pre-existing structures that have been built episodically, as mentioned earlier? So another really easy one.
That's Leo.
That's Andrew.
I can take this one as one of the builders of the report. So look, I think the question and the way it was phrased is has a nuance in there kind of suggesting that like you can never pull personality, like these agencies, these organizations are run by people, and so you're always going to have conflict, you're going to have disagreements. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. What we were really getting at in that recommendation as we looked through it is this kind of lacquering of laws and statutes and authorities that have really been printed on one another since the NIP structure was put into place. I believe it was in the Clinton administration. And starting with that time, which basically gave the blueprint of how cabinet agencies were going to work together, there have been a lot of changes, a lot of evolution. So the Department of Homeland Security was created. We're still 20 years away from CISA, right? So then there have been multiple PPDs, presidential directives, that sort of tried to clarify things, perhaps made a lot of improvements, but there's some kind of leftover language. What we're getting at is, I think, clarifying some of that statutory language can give us a real, maybe a more clear roadmap. The CISA coming into picture changes many things, and so there hasn't really been a clarification since that time. So at least from a report standpoint, which the question got to, that's what was in our head. That's what we were thinking. The stripping out the personalities and people that run these agencies will never happen. I've worked in government. Many of us here have worked in government. That is a function of it. In fact, like many times that makes things better. So that's kind of where we were going.
Absolutely. Oh, great. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time to join us today, and thank you to our panelists for their insights, and of course, thank you to the audience for your participation. You're what helps to absolutely make this a great event. As a reminder to everyone, the recording of this event is going to be available online on the Atlantic Council website, on Twitter, on Facebook, YouTube, and you can download and read the full report on the Atlantic Council website. Lastly, I'd like to take an opportunity to congratulate the task force co-chairs, General Clark and Secretary Chertoff, as well as our task force members, our rapporteurs for completing this report, and thank the Atlantic Council team for their work on this report and, of course, for putting on this event. It's an important opportunity for us to continue to engage in dialogue and engage in earnest debate about how we can all continue to best support important initiatives like supporting the transition of our energy system, become a more reliable, resilient resource for all of us. Please remember to visit the Atlantic Council website for future events and for our latest publications. And thank you again for joining us today.